Hello once again, dear children. In the last video, we looked at the theories of Lamarck and Darwin, and we stated that Lamarck had these two outdated laws, the law of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Just let's write that down so we can remember that. The law of acquired characteristics, where he said that whatever characteristic you acquire or get in your life, you'll pass it to your offspring. And we realize that this is totally irregular because there is no evidence to suggest that whatever characteristic you acquire will be passed down to your offspring. And then his law of use and disuse, where he said that the more frequently use and disuse, the more frequently you use an organ, the more developed and stronger it will become. The less frequently you use it, then it will become weaker until it eventually disappears. And we realize that this is not true as well, because there's no evidence to suggest that the more you use an organ, the more developed it becomes. Okay? So that was Lamarck. And then we looked at Darwin and looked at his theory of natural selection. Now here we said very importantly, we've got to state, let's see, first of all, let's go for it, darlings. Yeah, the variation, the genetic variation, let's put it down that way, isn't it? So the genetic variation that exists, well, the genetic variation will give rise to the physical variation, isn't it so, my darlings? Because your phenotype, your physical appearance, is determined by your genotype, your genetic composition. And what was the challenge? You had to know what was the challenge, because according to Darwin, there is something that will stimulate the changes that occur in the organisms. What was the challenge? It will be an environmental challenge. And then you also have to state which is the favorable characteristic and why is it favorable, and that those organisms survive, and which is the unfavorable characteristic and why it was unfavorable, causing those organisms to die. And then you would also state that the allele for the favorable characteristic is passed on to the next generation. And so you would have many more with this favorable characteristic amongst the offspring, until generation after generation, you will have all of them with that favorable characteristic. So this one here, my darlings, this one here would be Lamarck. Lamarck. Okay. And this particular one of natural selection would be Darwin. Now, as I said to you before, you would have to apply these theories. Okay. So now that you got that at the back of your mind, let's look at the first question. Okay. And as we look at the question, let me just undo this here. Okay, babies, because I'll be referring to the question now. Study the diagram below. Spotlight. Study the diagram below that shows the changes in the numbers of black and white mice living in an environment with light-colored sand. So you focus on the fact that it is light-colored sand. And the minute they're mentioning the color of an environment, you're looking at the characteristic of camouflage, isn't it? So camouflage means how well can the organism survive in the environment by not being spotted by predators. Because if it's the same color as the environment, it won't be spotted by predators. Okay, so let's look at it. Oh, there's this bird catching one of these mice, and it's catching a black mouse. So in the first frame, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 white mice, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 black mice. So equal numbers of white and black. But in January, in February, something happened. How do you know? Because our black mice reduced in number. So they must have reduced because somebody has picked them up and eaten them, while they did not take the white mice because it's still 5. And as you come to March, even further reduce the black mice are, and the white mice are still 5. So babies, once again, the characteristic that we're looking at is camouflage. So something has happened that would allow these white mice to survive. And what would, in fact, there was no change. It's just that against the light colored sand, the white mice were camouflaged and therefore not easily seen by the predator and therefore not eaten by the predator. The black mice were not camouflaged, so they had the unfavorable characteristic of being black. So what was the variation? The variation is that you had white mice and you had black mice. The favorable characteristic was that the white mice were camouflaged against the light-colored sand, and the black mice were noticeable on the white-colored sand as they were not camouflaged. And therefore, the black mice were easily spotted by the predator and eaten. And as you went from January to March, the black mice reduced in number until eventually you'd find that you got no black mice at all, because maybe this was not the breeding time, because generally you find that once these mice reach the breeding season, you will have many more white mice. Isn't that so? Because the favorable characteristic for whiteness, that allele will be passed on to their offspring. So a mouse population in an environment with light-colored sand. So very importantly to read, my darlings. As you read, you find that you can get lots of information. What phenomenon is illustrated? The phenomenon is the phenomenon of natural selection. Describe how the sequence of events labeled A, B, and C represents the phenomenon in question 5.1. So let's look at the answer. Okay, I told you what it would be, but let's see, my darlings, how would they give you the answer for 5 marks? How would they give you the answer for 5 marks? That's what we're interested in, isn't it so? We want to know how to get those. We know what to talk about. Well, what is it that they used? Sorry, this is all about human impact on the environment. Okay. How did they get out their 5 marks? It was question number 5, my babies. So we're going to question number 5. Very importantly, check with your teachers to get these downloaded onto your computers. Okay. There we go. Thank you for your patience. So, question 5, natural selection. So here they wanted you to specifically say what happening in each frame. You could not do a generalized explanation. So in A, there is variation in appearance of the mice. There were equal numbers of white and black mice. In B, the predator catches the black mice. Why? They were more visible. The white mice were camouflaged, and because the black mice were more visible, they reduced in number from 5 to 3 or whatever. In C, the population of white mice remains the same, but the number of black mice has further reduced because there was further predation. Now that is what they wanted for 5 marks. Okay, darlings? Let's go back to the question. Will the next generation of mouse population more likely be all white or all black? Of course, my darlings. These guys will now reproduce, passing the favorable characteristic of whiteness to their offspring. So most of them would be white. What happened to question 6? Let's see if we can find question 6, darlings. So to be on the other side, hey? Oh, this was the famous CAT one. Oh, we'll come back to question 6 because that's a new phenomenon I have to go through with you. Let's look at question 7. You do know horses didn't look so gorgeous as they do in modern day times, my darlings. This is a modern horse. The diagrams below represent the evolution of a horse compiled from fossil records. This is what it appeared like, 0.4 meters tall, was like 40 centimeters tall, babies. 40 centimeters, just a ruler and a bit, and 10 centimeters more. Wow, would you believe that? Hmm? So small. And then it became zero point 0.6 meters, that's 60 centimeters, 2 rulers tall. Put 2 rulers together. And then if you've ever stood against a modern horse, you would now know just how much of evolution has happened over the ages. It would have been lovely if they put down the time scale here as well. Notice that not only is there a change in the height of the horse, there's also a change in the toes. Notice they got 4 toes here, reduced to 3, one becoming bigger. Then there's 3, but the central one is even bigger until you only landed up with 1 toe. Notice the changes that happened over the period of time. How many times is the modern horse taller than its earliest ancestor? Show you're working. Earliest ancestor was the one you started off with. 0.4 meters, present day 1.6 meters. How much taller? You take 1.6 meters divided by 0.4 meters, and you'll say 4 times taller. 3 marks for nothing, my darlings. What happened to the appearance of the feet of the horse over time? Hmm? And paleontologists suggest that ancient horses lived in forests, but modern horses lived in open grassland. Explain one way in which modern horse is adapted for open grassland. The only difference between that one and that one is a toe. So let's look at how that big toe can help it. We're looking at question number 6. Let's get it, babies. Sorry. 7, sorry. 4 times bigger. What happened to the toes? Over time, the number of toes appeared to decrease in number, as we said, or the digits are now fused, but increase in size. So they have decreased in number, but I would have said specifically 1 has increased in size, isn't it so? Until you've gone to 1. Over the time, number of toes appear to decrease. Yes, we know. The digits are now fused, but increased in size. So you found digits are those, like the number of toes known as digits, are now fused to become 1, and they have now increased in size. So how come it's suited to be in an open grassland? The taller body or the legs enables it to look over the grasses and have a wider view. This is also applicable to us, darlings, when we as human beings were bipedal. So that gave us a taller body, enabling us to look over the grasses and have a wider view of any predators or any food available. The single fused toe of the modern horse enables it to run faster over open ground. Okay, it's open ground. And I would have said, they should have maybe told us that the open ground was like harder and it's easier to have 1 toe. If you had many toes, the many toes would sink into a marshy ground or a softer ground. But an open, harder ground, a single toe will enable it to run faster. I thought there's much more to that question. All right, babies. So, enough said. Okay, let's look at this one. Oh, this appeared as an essay question. Was terrible for the students. An ancestor of the elephant Phiomere had a long nose-like structure called a proboscis, which evolved into the trunk. The proboscis was used to gather leaves as food. The proboscis of Phiomere and the trunk of the elephant is shown, and the diagrams have been drawn to scale. In other words, this is quite small compared to your modern-day elephant. Explain the evolution of the elephant's trunk in terms of Lamarckism and Darwinism, as well as the way in which an increase in the length of the trunk could be achieved through artificial selection. So, new concept here, artificial selection. Old concept we learned about was Lamarckism and Darwinism. So when the children saw this, the first thing he said, oh my God, we didn't learn about elephants. However, my darlings, they can present any animal to you. It's about how you can use the knowledge that you gain and apply it in a new situation. Remember we said Lamarck said that they were all certain size or certain shape. There was no variation. And then changes happened, and this change was now passed on to their offspring because they acquired a change. So how would he explain the change from the proboscis to the trunk or the small elephant to the large elephant? is what children had difficulty in. Quite frankly, I'd have difficulty in that as well, my darlings. So let's see how they expected you to answer this particular question. Okay. So the ancestral elephant stretched its proboscis to get leaves in trees. The more it used its proboscis, the longer it became. The offspring then inherited the acquired longer proboscis. Over many generations, the length of the proboscis increased until it became a trunk. For the children to actually see that the proboscis became a trunk was a bit far-fetched of the examiner to do that to the child. But you could have said that the proboscis became longer and longer because they tried to reach the leaves that were higher up, because they told you that that elephant used the proboscis to eat the leaves. What would Darwin have said? Remember, he would have said that there was a great deal of variation. Some of them had long proboscises, some of them had short. I hope that is the plural. Then there was a change in environment. He would always talk about the change, and the competition for food began. So the change in environment was most probably that there was no food down and there were only food higher in the trees, just like the giraffes. So the animals with a short proboscis died because they could not reach the leaves, and those with the longer proboscis survived because they could reach the leaves. They then reproduced, passing on this characteristic to their offspring, and the next generation had a higher proportion of animals with longer proboscis. Until future generations, you had all the animals with these long proboscis. So, although it was a question that could be handled, it was a curved ball presented to the children. Okay? So the last part of the question spoke about artificial selection. I want to go back and talk to you about artificial and natural selection and another new concept called speciation before I come back to this particular set of questions. Okay, my darlings? So let's go back. Okay. All right. Artificial and natural selection. Now, natural selection is where nature is a selecting force. For example, if food only becomes available inside hard shells and no other food is available in the place. So food is only available inside hard shells and no other food is available is a change in that environment. So nature is the selecting force. So if there are birds present there, only those with strong beaks would be able to break open these hard shells and get the food inside. So they would survive and they would pass this favorable allele to their offspring. So those that did not have these hard, strong beaks would die because they can't break open those shells and they can't get the food inside. So that is nature as a selective force. So in natural selection, nature is the selective force. With artificial selection, my darling, is where humans will choose what they want to suit their needs. So over generations, over ages, I should say, that humans have been playing around with animals. They've been ant plants, to increase the yield. Yield means how much they can get out of them so that it will gain them more profit, gain them more food for the other humans. Are you with me? So for a long time, humans have been doing breeding experiments, especially your farmers, my darlings. They are the hugest experimenters here. So these breeding experiments, my baby, with a selected set of desirable characteristics, for example, increased quality and quantity of milk produced by cows. So for example, if there's a cow that produces good milk, and then they know there's a bull whose mother and grandmother were good milk producers. So they'll mate that cow that produces a lot of good milk with that bull whose mommy and grandmommy produced a lot of good milk. They'll mate them, and hopefully there will be an enhancing of that characteristic of good milk production in the papa cows that are produced. Okay, so you actually can enhance a desirable characteristic, or you can take two desirable characteristics, one from each parent, and hopefully the offspring will have both of those desirable characteristics. Now, this is where humans have been doing these breeding experiments. So therefore, humans represent the selective force. Know these differences, know at least two differences, darling, to give you a total of 5 marks. 1 for drawing the table and 2 for any set of differences. Now, when you're writing your differences as well, make sure you rule off. Okay. Secondly, let's choose another easy one. Natural selection occurs within a species. So you'd find that giraffes would change over a long, long period of time. Or as we saw just now, elephants change over a long, long period of time. So it occurs within a species. But with artificial selection, when humans are doing it, it may involve one or more species. It can involve one, but very often it can involve more than one species. Are you with me? So for example, here in artificial selection, if I can just show you the one that they farmers experimented with, is when they crossed a horse and a donkey. They crossed a horse and a donkey because they wanted desirable characteristics in their offspring. They wanted an animal that had the speed of a horse, but the strength of a donkey. So they wanted something faster than a donkey and something more than a horse could carry, an animal that can carry more than a horse can carry. So they crossed a horse and a donkey, which is not normal. Different species do not mate with each other under normal circumstances. A horse will not mate with a donkey. Horses stay with horses, donkeys stay with donkeys. Okay? So they did this and they produced an animal called a mule. This mule, my darlings, is faster than a donkey and can carry a lot of load like a donkey can. So it's got the speed of a horse, almost the speed of a horse, and it's got the ability of a donkey to carry large loads. So you involved two different species. So it may involve one or more species. Are you with me? So learn 2 of them off by heart. So let's go back to that question, Papas. Let's go back to this question here. Sorry, babies, let me just move this on. Let's go back to this question, and they asked you, we spoke about Lamarckism and Darwinism, and as well as the way in which an increase in the length of the trunk of the elephant could be achieved through artificial selection. In other words, humans brought this about. No, it wasn't nature selecting this, but humans brought this about. Are you with me? So artificial selection is what did humans do? So what would the answer look like, my darlings? Here we go. Humans select the elephants with desirable, in other words, I would have said humans would select the elephants with long trunks and mate them with each other. So those that are pure breeding for long trunks are further selected to mate to produce offspring with further longer trunks. So I would have said humans selected elephants with long trunks, mated them to produce offspring with long trunks. You'd have got 3 marks there. Are you with me? Those with pure breeding, we wouldn't even say that. All right, papas? That's what artificial selection is all about. All right, darlings. Now let's go back and look at punctuated equilibrium. This is a new concept, babies. This is a new concept in the syllabus, relatively new, because this is a new concept. And it was proposed by 2 guys, Aldrich and Gould, in 1974. So very, very recent, very recent. These was in the 1800s. This was 1974. Punctuated equilibrium, you are required to know the theory and how it is different from natural selection. So, based on explanations of Lamarckism and Darwinism, it is thought that evolution takes place through an accumulation of small or gradual changes that occur over a long period of time. Small changes, little ones, And when I say over a long period of time, it's thousands to millions of years, hundreds of thousands to millions of years. That's how long this evolution took place. Many people think that evolution will take place in a day or so. Okay. So, my darlings, and this is supported by many transitional fossils. This is like so contrary to what I'm going to say to you right now. Transitional fossils are fossils that have got characteristics of the one that appears before it in the history of time and characteristics of the one that will appear after it in the history of time. Okay? So, my babies, along came these guys here, Aldrich and Gould. Let me just write it out, eh? Normally when you're speaking about these guys and with my great spelling, Aldrich and Gould, very recent, 1974, they came up with the idea of punctuated equilibrium. And my darlings, I'd love for you to learn this off by heart. It is a hypothesis that explains the speed at which evolution took place. And according to this punctuated equilibrium, evolution is not always gradual. It doesn't occur slowly over a long period of time. So what did these guys propose, Aldrich and Gould? They said, evolution involves long periods of time where species do not change or change very little, known as equilibrium. So they said for long periods of time, hundreds and thousands of years, you'd find that species remain unchanged. And this alternates with short periods of time where rapid changes occur, drastic changes occur. So it's like this, Papas, if you had to draw something. So there's long periods of time like there's no change. And then in a short period of time, there's a drastic change. And then followed by a long period of time with no change. Short period of time, a drastic change. Long period of time, no change. Short period of time, a drastic change. This is like writing a sentence and punctuated with a full stop. Writing a sentence, punctuated with a full stop. So that's why you call it punctuated equilibrium. So evolution involves long periods of time where species do not change or change very little. This alternates by short periods of time where rapid changes occur. As a result, you must say, new species are formed in a short period of time relative to long periods of time where there's no change. So new species are formed in these short periods of time. How did they know this? This is supported by the absence of transitional fossils because the change happened so fast. You went from there to there in such a short period of time. There was no like in between fossil because there was no organism that had characteristics that was a little bit of before and a little bit of after. You just went from this to that. From this to that. It was like no transition. It wasn't like a smooth move from one to the other. You just went from one to the other. Okay, so this is supported by the absence of transitional fossils. To date, they haven't asked too big questions or complicated questions on this. However, I will pick out questions from past year papers to deal with this in another lecture. Okay, my papas? So that's your punctuated equilibrium. So once again, papas, I'd like to repeat. Evolution involves long periods of time where there's little or no change, alternating with short periods of time where there's a rapid change. I don't like to say rapid because rapid means short, isn't that so? Where there's drastic changes which occur. And during this short period of time, new species are formed. No? And this is supported by the fact that there are hardly any transitional fossils. Okay, my darlings? Good. So let's look at the last concept in general evolution, and that is speciation. Speciation is where you form a new species. And of course, speciation will occur through natural selection as well, isn't it so? Because why, babies? As a result of natural selection taking place over a long period of time, let's go with that guy again. Which guy? The torch. As a result of natural selection taking place over a period, or I would have said a long period of time, the characteristics of organisms may change to such an extent that they cannot reproduce with the original members of the species to produce fertile offspring. Now, what's the definition of species, my darling? Definition of species, I teach children to remember the definition of species as SIVF. No? Similar characteristics, these organisms have similar characteristics, able to interbreed to produce viable and fertile offspring. Are you with me, my darlings? Let's look at that mnemonic again, babies. Organisms of similar characteristics and are able to produce viable and fertile offspring. Now, when you say viable, they're capable of surviving and living. They're capable of surviving and living under those conditions. Fertile offspring means they be able to produce more babies. Okay, that's the definition of species. And if you're looking at the definition of population, sorry about this, this is not a very subtle mnemonic. Okay, this is the definition of what again, my papas? That's a definition of a species. Now, the definition of species fits into the definition of population. Fits into the definition of population because population is organisms of the same species in the same habitat at the same time and are able to interbreed to produce viable and fertile offspring. Are you with me? So they are the same species in the same habitat at the same time and are able to interbreed, to produce viable and fertile offspring. So population is of the same species. Therefore, members of a population must be able to interbreed with each other. Okay? But if you one species, my papa, you cannot interbreed with another species. No? Because species have similar characteristics that will make them different to another species. So when you're talking about speciation, it's very important to remember that two different species do not mate with each other because there are barriers that exist, things that prevent them from reproducing with each other, which we'll be looking at just now. But most of the questions on the speciation are based on the fact is that do you understand that two different species do not mate with each other? How do they become different species? Because natural selection, my darling, would occur. Are you with me? As a result of natural selection, changes would occur. And you would find that they cannot reproduce with the original members of the species to produce fertile offspring. So if they cannot produce fertile offspring, my darlings, they are two different species. We say they have become a new species, and the process by which a new species is formed is called speciation. Okay, so if we've got all of that, you can replay this and check it out and remember these mnemonics. So speciation is a process by which a new species is formed, but here specifically we're looking at the formation of a new species when there is a geographical barrier. In other words, something that will now separate a population. So if there was one population in an area, let's do some drawing, okay, papas? If there was a population in an area, so just in case this is my area, okay, and there are organisms of the same kind. I see, papa, what happened to my diagram? Sorry. And if there were organisms here, let's say they all look like ones, okay, organisms of the same species is a population. Isn't that so, baby? So hell of a lot of these ones, no? In a population, they all have similar characteristics, able to interbreed, to produce viable and fertile offspring. They're there in the same habitat at the same time. Are you with me? So there's our population. So in case there is a drastic change where this population becomes split into two by a barrier. Okay, so let's draw a splitting. You think I can draw a splitting? So this population becomes split into two. Now the barrier must be much bigger. Okay, it must be like an ocean or a river, something that generally splits this population into two different areas. So this geographical barrier can be an ocean that you found during continental drift. You know, continental drift was during the time that all those continents separated from each other. You learned this in grade 10. Or you found that there was a river that changed its course, and the river separated this population into two groups. So here you got one group of that population, one group here, okay? And then you've got another group now in a totally different area. So that one population became split into two populations. Now, if the environment is different, are you with me? So natural selection will occur here and natural selection will occur here. So natural selection occurs independently in both these areas, such that, my darlings, these organisms become genotypically and phenotypically different from each other. So if this, for example, if this environment was the same as its original environment, and this environment was different, then you would find that these organisms become genotypically and phenotypically different. Most probably they will get some other features to them. I'm just showing you some other features to them, you know. So they look different from those, you know. They become phenotypically different from their original, from the original population. So if this environment was completely different from that, so natural selection happens here, natural selection happens here, but this could stay the same as its original. But if it had a new environment and a completely new environment, then this could also change. Are you with me? So you'd find that this would change. So changes would occur here. I should have drawn completely new changes, but I hope you're getting what I'm talking about. So natural selection occurs here, natural selection occurs here. So we say natural selection occurs independently. What was the barrier? Most probably a river. A river completely separated it. So in this new environments, natural selection occurred independently, such they become genotypically and phenotypically different from each other. So when they became separated papas, there was no way they could reproduce with each other. In other words, there was no gene flow. Only when you reproduce, there's gene flow. Okay? So because these guys couldn't reach those guys, then they couldn't reproduce with each other. Then each one underwent natural selection. Then each population became genotypically and phenotypically different. Are you with me? Such that if I have to remove this barrier, let me take my eraser and remove the barrier. I removed everything. Sorry. But if I have to remove that barrier, if these guys met those guys, they say, oh my God, who the hell are you? You know? And they will never reproduce because they've now become different species. So because they become different species, they will not reproduce with each other. Are you with me? So that is now speciation. Okay, so let's see how we read about it, and then I will show you an example. Good. A population of a particular species may become split by a geographical barrier. Example, a river. Example, an ocean can be a geographical barrier. Example, a mountain can be a geographical barrier. For example, if there's a huge volcanic eruption and the lava solidifies to form a mountain, that becomes a geographical barrier. Are you with me? As a result, the two parts of the population cannot interbreed. Are you with me? Just make it bit bigger for you. As a result, the two parts of the population cannot interbreed because they can't reach each other because there's a barrier. There is no gene flow between the organisms. So the only time there's gene flow is when there is reproduction. So the next thing, learn this off by heart, nanas. If you learn this off by heart, you just apply it to a situation. Natural selection occurs independently. They like this word here, independently in each population. So irrespective of what's happening in the other one, natural selection will occur. Now, sometimes you find that when the barrier exists, one side may experience the same environment as its original population, while the other side may be in a new environment. Either way, papas, there will be two different populations or two different species at the end of this process. Natural selection occurs independently. This is due to different environmental conditions. So why? Here we must state what was the environmental condition, you know. So if you're applying this, state what was the environmental condition. As a result, the two populations become genotypically and phenotypically different from each other. You must say the word genotypically first, because the genotype will determine the phenotype. Genotypically and phenotypically different from each other over time. Even if the two populations mixed at a later time, if they have to meet, they will not be able to interbreed again. Why? Because one or both parts of the population have become new species. All right, babies? Good. Let's look at the barriers, babies. Barriers. What prevents them from breeding with each other? So you'd find that if they're in a completely new environment, you'd find that they breed at different times of the years. This one applies to both. Let me just say what each one applies to, because you would know that some of them apply only to plants and some of them apply only to animals. So this one applies to plants and animals. So breeding at different times of the year. So if they're so separated by an ocean, for example, you would find that some of them would breed in June, some of them would breed in December. So if they're breeding at different times of the year, then that would become a barrier that will prevent them from breeding with each other when they meet up with each other. Species-specific courtship behavior. Of course, this will only apply to animals because only animals do the dance or do something to attract the opposite sex. Are you with me? So whilst a crab will be doing a species-specific courtship behavior like rattling its pincers, let's take another animal, Lulus. A cow, for example, may be attracted to the strength of a bull. So a cow would not find the crab attractive. So species-specific courtship behavior. Adaptation to different pollinators, of course, this applies only to plants. Where the flowers are shaped in a particular fashion, that will allow, for example, birds to only pollinate it or certain insects to pollinate it. So whatever pollinates that particular species will not pollinate another species. You don't find roses going and having pollen being transferred to a marigold, for example. You know, roses with roses, marigolds with marigolds. Only farmers will go and interfere and do things differently. Are you with me? Infertile offspring, generally this is caused by, it's generally with your animals, could be with your plants as well, where you find that you take two different species, like in artificial selection, and make them with each other, like the horse and the donkey, to produce a mule. The mule, my darling, is an infertile offspring. It cannot produce babies. The mule is an infertile offspring. Okay, it cannot produce babies, so infertile offspring. So that mule cannot now go and have more mules. So that becomes a reproductive barrier because it is infertile. And the one that's missing over here is, what is the one that's missing over here, babies? is compatibility of sexual organs. Yeah? Compatibility of your reproductive organs. You'd find that there must be a fit between the reproductive organs for them to have babies. In not yeah, that's actually the incompatibility. So the incompatibility of the reproductive organs, where they now cannot mate with each other because their reproductive organs are not suited for that particular fit for sexual reproduction. Okay, so that becomes a barrier for reproduction. All right. So very importantly, you must know these mechanisms for reproductive isolation. So here, if you find that the farmer interferes, it could appear to apply to plants as well, if the farmer interferes. Okay, my babas, so that's the mechanism for reproductive isolation. So with this, we bring an end to general evolution. When I see you in the next one, I'll be doing applications for this and then moving on to human evolution. God bless you, my darlings. Until I see you again, go and look at some of the questions and hopefully you'll be able to answer before I can answer. Thank you.